Greetings from the northwest of Ireland. My name is Roger Buck, and this is the second of a new series of YouTube videos where I'm speaking about the mystery and the miracle of Catholicism, but also the fate of Catholicism in the modern world. And today we're going to be talking about the crisis in the Church, but really what my main focus that I want to focus on today is not so much the crisis, but the hope I have for the Church, and the hope I have for a new spirit of renaissance and revitalization in Catholicism today. But speaking in terms of the crisis, I'll recap what I said last time a little. I noted last time that the Catholic Church has rebounded again and again in the course of 2,000 years. It rebounded in the early Roman centuries, it rebounded in the Dark Ages, it rebounded in the Middle Ages, it rebounded at the time of the Protestant Reformation. There's a great Catholic thinker, Valentin Tomberg, who speaks about the degeneration and the regeneration of the Church, that the Catholic Church regularly degenerates and then is mightily regenerated by the Holy Spirit. So if we just go back 500 years ago and we go to the Reformation, we see, I would say, that that was a time of real degeneration of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was corrupt at that time. There was a crisis in the Church. The Reformers, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, they had legitimate complaints. That is not to say that what they did was legitimate, far from it. But they had legitimate complaints. At the same time that Catholicism was degenerating, dying at that time, becoming corrupt, there was also a great deal of denial. People denied that the Church had a problem. People denied that the Church was in crisis. And even after the Reformation began, this went on for decades. There were people saying, oh, Luther, he's going to come back. Those Lutherans, there's not a problem here. There was denial that there was a crisis in the Church. And personally, I see something very like that today. The Church is in crisis. There's tremendous and obvious collapses in the number of vocations, collapses in the number of baptisms. We could go on and on about this. There's a collapse in the spirit of the Church. The spirit of the Church no longer feels that it's counter to modern culture. So often it's just going with the flow of modern culture. But the Church has never been about going with the flow of modern culture. It's been about fighting for something different. But this is what happened at the time of the Protestant Reformation. The Church eventually stopped denying the crisis, and the Church got its act back together again. So, within a few decades of Luther, a mighty new spirit emerged in Catholicism. A new passion, a new zeal for the faith emerged. It emerged through the Counter-Reformation, through the Council of Trent, through great saints like St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Charles Borromeo, St. Francois de Sales. There was a rebirth of passion and zeal for what Catholicism was. And this new fire in the Church regenerated the Catholic Church all across southern Europe. In the north of Europe, England, places like that, Catholicism was tremendously persecuted and shrank to a very small proportion. But nonetheless, even in northern Europe, this would lead to Catholicism eventually returning. There was a new fire that was born in the 16th century that continued to regenerate the Church. And yet, and I'm following Tomberg here, slowly a degeneration came in. And I think that what we've been seeing in the last decades is like a modern degeneration of the Church, and we're waiting for another regeneration to happen. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I actually do believe that it is beginning to happen. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think it helps if we go back 50 years and we look at the late 1960s. If you try to read about that time, and I've tried to study it a lot over the years, you see this almost euphoria in the Church, with no sense that anything at all might be going wrong. Hence you see a complacency. There's this belief in a new springtime of the church, and hardly anyone is raising a contrary voice. Yes, there are a few exceptions. Obviously, there's Archbishop Lefebvre, there's Dietrich von Hildebrand. I draw a lot of inspiration from Valentin Tomberg, who really warned in the late 60s that the church was headed towards the abyss. But these voices were few and far between. And it's very, very different now, 50 years later. Everywhere you see an awareness of the crisis of the church, with a possible exception of the Vatican, but that's another story. But at the grassroots level, and at the level of many, many younger priests coming up, you see this awareness that something has gone wrong. And you also see this zeal and this fire that I'm getting at. I'm really going to be asking this video about the potential for a 21st century renewed zeal and fire in the church. Now, I see this in all kinds of different places. Now, I'm a traditionalist, so I'm obviously speaking about the traditional movement in the church, where I see that very much, but I don't only mean that. I see a new orthodoxy in many, many, many younger priests who are upcoming today. I see it in, these great sort of organizations that are now emerging actually from America. I'm talking about things like EWTN, I'm talking about Church Militant, things like that. You see this zeal, you see this fire. Now, if you follow my videos, you will see that I can sometimes be fairly critical and concerned about a lot of the impacts of American culture, on Europe and Ireland, where I'm living now. I am an American, I've got British parents, but I am concerned. But one thing that I really need to compliment America on greatly, really, really want to say just God bless America about, is some of the very, very great material coming over the American internet, and I think it's going to help re-evangelize Europe. But also, I spent a couple of years living in France, and France is probably the place where the Latin Mass is the strongest. It's all over the place in France. France is obviously the birthplace of these new great orders of priests, like the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, which has been an incredible blessing in my own spirituality, and I'm going to speak about the Institute more in another video. So a great deal is happening from France as well. Anyway, much, much more might be said. If there were time, we could talk about all kinds of new initiatives on the web, radio stations, other TV stations. I go into this a little bit in my new book I have written, but all I want to say now, just to make clear, is that I'm not saying that any of these things are perfect. Obviously, we live in a fallen world, and none of these Catholic initiatives is perfect. But what I am trying to say is that there is a new spirit, a new passion, a new zeal for the faith, which I really don't think was nearly so evident 40 or 50 years ago. But really, what I think I might best do now to sort of illustrate what I mean is to try to speak personally. For the past several years, I've been involved in an online community, traditional Catholic community forum called Fish Eaters. And Fish Eaters is not only a forum, it's also an extensive traditional Catholic website with extensive information on traditional Catholic devotions, practices, the Latin Mass, and so forth. And it's all been pioneered by a woman who's become a very dear friend of mine online called Tracy Tucherone. And really, I find something extraordinary about what Tracy is pioneering there and the people there. And I can go on about this for a long time, but I'll just give you a couple of brief examples. So one of the things that I find just very moving in that forum is that, for example, I find discussions happening there amongst young men, and they're talking online about how to keep chaste. So how to remain chaste until they find a wife, or how to remain chaste and faithful to their wives, honor their wives, or be chaste if they have a religious vocation. They're talking about their struggles with the incredible sexual immorality of our age. And I look at these young men talking about this, and I ask, where on earth else besides fish eaters, could you find these kinds of discussions happening? We're living in an age where young men are being bombarded like never before in the entire history of the human race by pornography. When I grew up as an adolescent in the 70s, pornography wasn't just a few mouse clicks away. It was hard to get hold of. I shudder to think what I would have been like had I had today's computer porn, and if I didn't have the sacraments of the church. And I watch this younger generation struggling with these things online, and I see how that community is really doing something extraordinary. It's against the modern world in a very, very creative way in many instances. Now, I don't agree with everything that's on that forum, but I just see so much that's moving there to me. So, for example, it's like, I'm afraid the way I see a lot of modern Catholicism is like, dare I say it, like a fish just going with the flow, or even a dead fish floating down the river. By contrast, so much that I see at fish eaters is like a mighty salmon bounding upstream. Now, it might seem a digression, but I very definitely want to pay a tribute to both fish eaters and Tracy, to this fish that's swimming mightily against the current, mightily upstream. This community that is international, but it's just full of a lot of, is mainly American, just regular people in middle America, mainly, who are getting support and encouragement and help. Indeed, I see Tracy sort of nurturing this community. I see her pouring her lifeblood into it. I also want to really say that Tracy has really functioned as an educator for me. There's so much about the modern world that I'm really personally quite clueless about. And, we're told that we live in this multicultural, pluralistic society. I have to say, it seems to me the more that I look at modern media over the last 20, 30, 40 years has become narrower and narrower and narrower. We're getting a perspective that is very, very politically correct and thought-controlled like never before. And Tracy helps me to break out of that. She helps me to sort of understand certain things in the ongoing sexual revolution, developments like normalizing polygamy or normalizing, even pedophilia, relationships between men and younger adolescents. I'm educated through fish eaters. I'm educated, I get a different perspective. So, again, I can't endorse everything that's on fish eaters. Some of it goes too far for me, if I'm honest. But I believe in giving credit where credit is due. As we progress with these videos, I really want to tell you about the sources of my videos, the people that have inspired me and touched me. Some of these or educated me. Some of these are in the past. Great Catholics like Hilaire, Belloc, like K.Chesterton, Valentin Tomberg. Also Catholic authors in the present like Charles Coulombe or Thomas Stork or Michael Martin. They're educators for me. But Tracy is also an educator for me. Anyway, I'm going to digress even further because I want to talk about other sources that I'll be drawing from in these videos, including even some non-Catholic thinkers and writers. One source that may raise a few eyebrows here and there is Noam Chomsky. Now, don't get me wrong. Please don't get me wrong. I know that so much of what Chomsky stands for is odious. I'll even go further, it's monstrous. You know, for example, I think back 100 years ago, and if you had told people 100 years ago that abortion would be commonplace in the West, all kinds of people, not just Catholics, not just Christians, would be shocked. They would think the world had gone insane. But now we're actually reaching a point where politicians, you know, people like Bernie Sanders are at least very strongly implying that so-called abortion rights should be extended right up until the moment of birth. Things like this are coming down the line. Again, people like Tracy are serving to educate me, and Chomsky believes in that whole cultural trajectory. So I'm not trying to defend Chomsky. Nonetheless, I do draw certain things from him. Two things in particular. First, I think there is a very, very useful critique there of the worst effects and ravages of modern day, unbridled, global capitalism. It's clear to me, and we'll be talking about it more in the videos, that such capitalism is causing untold misery for the world's poor. But moreover, it's also destroying Catholic and Christian culture, which is a point that I think is often lost to conservatives. Now, it's not a point that would be lost on great conservatives of the past, great men of the right, such as K.Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. I think they would be very, very, very appreciative of Chomsky's critique of the terrible excesses of capitalism. And I need to make a point here. When I speak about capitalism, I am not talking about free enterprise. In fact, I would say that modern day capitalism is very much the opposite of free enterprise. The only thing that's free in modern day capitalism are the gigantic corporations. No, I think if you're wanting free enterprise, you need to start thinking of something along the lines of what Chesterton and Belloc meant by distributism. And I want to be talking about distributism more as these videos progress. But there's also another area that I draw from Chomsky, and it's very much where he is speaking about what I was saying earlier, that our media telescopes everything down narrower and narrower and narrower to a point of view that's acceptable to our governments and is acceptable to the gigantic capitalist corporations. He's very, very good on that, in my view. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about fake news, and personally, I find it a bit of a joke, because Chomsky makes very, very clear that the main organs of the media, the New York Times in the West, papers like The Economist, you know, in the British Isles, they're giving us a very, very, very filtered view of the news, indeed, to suit their interests. And indeed, he's not saying anything different here than Chesterton and Belloc were saying. 100 years ago, Chesterton and Belloc were making exactly the same point. In fact, Chesterton is famous for his famous weekly newspaper called GK's Weekly. That was an attempt to combat fake news then, to combat the manipulation of the media of the news. So fake news is nothing new. Belloc and Chesterton were onto it 100 years ago. Well, I appear to be digressing a lot, and I may be in danger of trying to say too many things in one video. But I wanted to do things here. I wanted to foreshadow what I'm going to be talking about in the future. So yes, I'm going to be talking about people like Belloc and Chesterton. I've also wanted to talk about modern internet initiatives like Fish Eaters, which in so many ways I actually think is carrying on the same spirit that Chesterton and Belloc had of fighting against the tide of modernity. But it's hard to do all that in one video. I've been meandering, and now I'd like to sort of tie it all up, you know, maybe put a little bow on it and make a nice, neat, tidy little package. And I'm not going to do that because I can't. But I think what's at the essence of everything that I've been saying is counter-revolution. And what do I mean by counter-revolution? Well, we probably need to do another whole video on that as well. But in essence, I'm talking about a culture that is informed by the church, and not a church that is going downstream floating like a dead fish, but a church that dares to challenge the world, a church that is not kowtowing to the world. That's what I'm getting at with counter-revolution. But yeah, it's hard to sort of sum this all up in one video. Maybe I could say it this way, very, very simply for now. Friends, as far as I can see, the world is in terrible danger. Economically, ecologically, socially, the West is in danger. The West is in danger of losing its soul, if not its sanity. And I really have no hope for the future of the West without the church. And I have no hope for the future of the church without tradition and without orthodoxy. This is why I want to celebrate counter-revolution, authentic counter-revolution, wherever I see it. I see it at Fish Eaters. I see it in what my friend Tracy is doing. There's a link down below for Fish Eaters if you want to check that out. There's also a link for my 2 books on counter-revolution, where I go into all of this much, much more. But I'll also keep trying to unfold and unpack these themes that I've begun opening out in these first 2 videos. I'll keep trying to talk about that. And in the next video, I really want to talk about how we can keep the fire alive, how we can kindle the fire of Catholic counter-revolution. That's all from me for now. God bless you, and thank you for listening.